morning, Warsaw. Today is Tuesday, 1st of August, the day that the uprising breaks out, and it will be quite cloudy with some showers, with highs of 18 degrees Celsius. That's 64 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 5:11 a.m. and sunset at 8:44 p.m. We are on the first day of the Warsaw Uprising. Alina, what is happening on this day?
Thank you so much for that intro, Philippe. Well, the uprising officially begins at 5 p.m. However, the preparations began much earlier, especially for the people on the ground. The night before, an order by the commander of the uprising, Antoni Chruściel, went out stating that the uprising was to begin on the 1st of August at 5 p.m., which would be W hour. The problem being that the order went out a little bit too late and the policing hour had already begun. So when it was lifted in the morning, the messengers went out again to spread the news. And from that early hour, Warsaw was in a complete buzz. A really great example of this is Napoleon Square, which was made up of beautiful pre-war buildings and had shops all the way around. Today, it looks like a mess. Thank you, communism. Anyway, moving on. Young people were seen milling about in large overcoats. And just as Philippe told us, it was quite warm, so not the weather to be wearing such attire. What they had underneath were weapons and messages that they were passing on to each other. At about 1:30 in the northern part of the city, a car was stopped and it was filled to the brim with weapons that the insurgents were moving. This is something that they tended to do at this time. And then a shootout broke out, of course, because they weren't going to be stopped. And some historians or some people like to say that this was the beginning of the uprising. That part of the city was closed off, which became a massive inconvenience to the insurgents. But then other shots were also fired at about 4 p.m. in the western part of the city and some in the south. But our W was set for 5 p.m. and that's when it all kicked off in the rest of the city. But not everyone knew when our W was to begin. Some people, like Father Michał Czartoryski, which we will come back to him actually in the story, he's a Dominican priest and he was on his way to the dentist when he got caught up in all the chaos. He joined the nearest fighting group. Or, for example, Edward Żółciński, who was being arrested by the Gestapo in his friend's apartment. He was a chemistry student who dropped stink bombs in the German theatres. I love this man. He was absolutely fantastic. Because shots were fired outside of the window of the apartment that he was in, the Germans got distracted and he managed to escape out of the window. He couldn't join his assigned combat group. Instead, he managed to join the closest one he could find. What is really interesting is the commander of the Home Army, Tadeusz Burkomorowski, and the way that he saw how these early hours began.
The Home Army soldiers were still normal passers-by, mixing with the crowd of civilians and entering their assigned houses in small groups. The buildings had been chosen with care according to a plan. For the most part, they were corner houses at important crossroads, facing railway stations, German barracks, stores or public buildings. They were all close to the points which were to be attacked and were to be taken in the first hours. The men would ring the bell of the flat and hand an order to the occupants for requisition signed by the authorities of the uprising. The occupants were excited but never showed the slightest resentment. On the contrary, they did their best to help in every way and offered the soldiers their best food. The men took up their positions at windows in attics and on chimneys at the entrances to the buildings, enclosed and barricaded from within. A sentry in the courtyard would forbid all occupants any access to the street for fear that the final preparations might be revealed to the enemy. 30 minutes before 0 hour, all preparations were completed. The soldiers brought out their arms and put on a white and red armband. The first open sign of a Polish army on Polish soil since the occupation. For 5 years they had all awaited this moment. Now the last second seemed an eternity. At 5 o'clock they would cease to be an underground resistance movement and would become once more regular soldiers fighting in the open.
So our W is 5 o'clock, but nobody in the city yet knows when. They all know there's going to be an uprising. They're all making preparations for it. And in fact, they've been, preparing weapon stores and food stores and things for weeks, if not months, some of them years. But they begin to hear as these messages come out now across the city. So, for example, Zoe Elżbieta Zawadzka, who has served as a courier during the war. She served as an emissary. She got to Britain in 1943. She was chained with the Chikocemni, the special paramilitary. She's parachuted back in time to take her role in the Warsaw Uprising. She's going to be taking a logistics role. But she only finds out when she goes to a pharmacy and someone very significantly points to the pharmacy clock and points to a number 5 on it. That's how she knows that is going to be W hour. So that's the sort of way that people are communicating across the city to get ready for the uprising.
And crucially, this isn't just young men, is it? This is women as well. This is even young people in the scouting movement. This is it is predominantly the young, but it's a really broad spread of Warsaw society, isn't it?
That's right. I mean, how many people are in Warsaw at this point? There's about 1 million Poles living in Warsaw, as well as the occupiers. And the Home Army is, well, they estimate now about 40 to 50,000 people. 10% of them are women. And there's diversity in other ways as well. There's various different nationalities. We can talk about that later, different faith groups and so on. But they're not a highly armed force. They've only got about 3,500 weapons. So there's not enough to go around. And Bohr actually says that, all the men will get the weapons. In fact, women had done a lot of stockpiling and making arms and ammunition, and there are female sapper teams. So there is a real diversity from the start, but they are massively outgunned, outarmed, and outmanned as well. I mean, they don't have the same numbers as the German forces either. So it's high stakes, but they have got this hugely important element of surprise and this massive determination as well, fighting will.
And of course, no heavy equipment. So that's something to bear in mind. So they are, as we said before, they are banking on essentially, taking over power in a vacuum, and that the Germans would continue their retreat. And of course, as we know, that didn't happen.
I just want to add a couple of statistics here. I know some of our listeners like statistics. I mean, don't we all? So we've got approximately 1,500 rifles, 2,500 pistols, 400 submachine guns, 90 heavy machine guns, and 25,000 grenades. And that's it. That's all there is for all of these people who are taking part in the uprising.
Lots of petrol, bottles of petrol, that sort of thing as well.
I just want to cut in here really quickly and throw in a story about my grandfather, because leading up to the uprising, him and his platoon spent a lot of time moving weapons around the city to make sure everybody is well stocked. And it's quite well known through testimonies that my grandfather's platoon was one of the best armed and ready to go during the Warsaw Uprising. It's quite interesting, really, reading the testimonies of him moving weapons around and how they get stuck and he has to hold a gun to someone to get their way. It's very, very, very interesting. Claire, tell us a little bit about Zoe's experience. We haven't talked as much about her as we should, really.
I mean, Zoe herself, she is going to be looking after, she's basically quartermastering. She's looking after the logistics of supply of foods and medicines, checking field hospitals and so on. So she's preparing for that. And so she's not fighting in the front line with a gun in hand. But so she goes up, she puts her armband on. The insurgents have got white and red armbands, the colour of Poland, with the symbol of the resistance printed on them, or sometimes WP for Polish Armed Forces. So she pulls her armband on, delighted to be back in uniform, if you like, symbolic uniform, and goes up to watch from the first floor of her headquarters to look down in the streets for the last hour of occupation. So it's 4:00 and she looks down and she saw a platoon, a Home Army resistance platoon, a group of young men, and they already were wearing their armbands openly and they had pistols out. So it was clear to anyone watching that this was the start of organised resistance. And as she watched, sort of shocked by this, as the young men reached the corner, it was already beginning to rain a little bit. There was a light rain in Warsaw that day, and one of them skidded on the cobblestones, and suddenly a shot rang out and she just saw this guy crumple over. She said later that dense shooting followed and the bodies lay awkwardly, blood pooling out on the street. So this is some of the first casualties of the uprising. She said they mowed them all down. And then she raced downstairs because she knew that she had stretchers down there ready to go. So she and her friend raced down, bumped into each other on the stairs, grabbed the stretcher. But then a medic team came in, which was 2 nuns and 2 female civilian volunteers to be medics. And they grabbed the stretcher and they actually had a little tussle for a while downstairs. I think it took Zoe a moment to realise that, her need to serve wasn't the biggest need at this moment, and that she had to let the medics do their job. So that the medics, the 4 women, go out and then they're all mown down and shot as well. And so that is immediately the brutality of what's happening. These medics are going out with a stretcher with red crosses on their armbands, and they're shot down as well. So that's at 4 o'clock. That's before W hour at 5. It's already kicking off.
Another really interesting person that witnessed Hour W is Władysław Szpilman. Everybody knows him, or people should know him from the film The Pianist. I think I'm going to quote from his testimony here. I really recommend people to go out and read this book. It's fabulous. It's filled with so many interesting details. But he says here, I went to the window. Peace reigned in the streets. I saw the normal pedestrian traffic, perhaps rather less of it than usual. But this part of Aleja Niepodległości had never been very busy. A tram coming down the street from the Technical University drew up at the top. It was almost empty. A few people got out, women, an old man with a walking stick, and then 3 young men got out too, carrying long objects wrapped in newspaper. If you remember what I mentioned about earlier, young men carrying things. They stopped outside the first tram car. One looked at his watch and then cast a glance around him. And suddenly he knelt down in the road, put the package he was carrying onto his shoulder, and a series of rapid clattering sounds were heard. The newspaper at the end of packet began to glow and revealed the barrel of a machine gun. At the same time, the other 2 men nervously shouldered their own weapons. The young man's shots were like a signal given to the neighbourhood. Soon afterwards, there was shooting everywhere, and when the explosions in the immediate vicinity died down, you could hear shots coming from the city centre, any number of them. I think it's such a fascinating way to be able to perceive this. He's obviously shut up in his apartment. His friend has left, and he experiences the Warsaw Uprising literally in the first moments. And he writes a lot about it in his memoir.
So how does it look at the end? So they start the operation at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. What successes do they score initially in those first few hours, the end of the first day?
Well, let's go for the victories first. I know they seized the main power plant and the German arsenal, and they did liberate a lot of the inner city. So there is this feeling of optimism there. And because I've looked more at the women, I know that some of the female sapper teams have been involved early on. So there's a woman called Dr. Zofia Frania. She was a medical doctor, and she serves as a medic through the Warsaw Uprising. But she's also been running female sabotage teams, little cells of 5 who've been going out, blowing up railways and so on beforehand, and also supplying weapons to the Warsaw Ghetto for their uprising, which happened the year earlier.
That's very Polish. Doctors doubling as saboteurs is very Polish, isn't it?
Oh, she's absolutely remarkable. Her trainer in sabotage and explosives was known as Rail because he blew up so many railways. Anyhow, so she's already going out, and her sapper teams are the female sappers, and they are involved in blowing up a few walls, and they help with the capture of the police headquarters, which is of course is useful because there's some more small arms in there, all of which are very, very precious. And they take the Baroque Holy Cross Church, which is a symbolic victory, isn't it? Because that's where Chopin's heart is buried, the great Polish composer. So that has real, emotional and impact for morale as well. So there are some successes, but Alina, do you want to do some of the things they don't take?
Just to reiterate a little bit what you said, Claire, it's interesting that they'd captured the whole of the Old Town, most of the Midtown. And I just want to throw in there also the Prudential Building, which is the second largest building in Warsaw, obviously not today, but back in 1944 it was. So let's talk a little bit about the losses. They are pretty horrific. So again, parts of Midtown have not been taken and they're still under German control, including what's now currently the Presidential Palace and that whole section there where is Piłsudski Square. So the Saski Palace where the Tomb of the Unknown Soldiers, that whole area is under German control, the main post office, but the insurgents gained that pretty quickly in the next couple of days, but that still hasn't been captured. They haven't captured most of the strongholds in the south of the city, so the Germans are still more or less in that area. Police barracks on Aleja Szucha is another one, but they're very, very well fortified. We'll hear a little bit more about Aleja Szucha in the coming days. None of the railway stations have been taken, so incredibly strategic points. The racetrack in the south, the horse racetrack, that hasn't been taken either. That's a very large area to be able to take. That ends in complete and utter failure. The airports, again, 2 very important strategic strategic points that the insurgents haven't managed to take are Kenchi Airport, which is currently Chopin Airport, and Bemowo, which is in the west of the city. Also the airport in Bielane. There are severe losses in that area. But what's very interesting is that the insurgents damage the airport so severely over the next coming days that the Germans can't use it to take off and bomb the city. None of the bridges have been taken, so this causes a massive problem for Praga, which is the east bank. That has not been seized by insurgents either. It's a huge area that is completely taken over by the Germans. And we will hear probably a little bit more about that in the next coming days, about the situation in Praga, the Soviets, and Berling's army.
They've done well, but they haven't done as well as they had intended. But nevertheless, as you say, when the flag is raised at the top of the Prudential building, it's 68 metres high, 16 stories, and then everyone else gets out flags as well. So these very crumpled, hidden, dirty Polish flags come out and are flown from windows. And there is this real sense. Zoe remembers seeing this, she calls it a state of euphoria. She said it gave us some retaliation for the nightmarish evacuation, she means, of September 1939. So there is this massive sense of joy. And it's quite romantic as well. She sees people coming out and singing these songs, old ballads, or patriotic songs. A lot of the military songs are very patriotic in Poland. And she sees, romantic tender pairs of soldiers, he says, singing romantic ballads, strolling away into the dark. So there is this feeling, we've survived the first day, we've done quite well, it's going to be over in a few days, we're doing okay. There's this massive sense of euphoria. But there's a lot of work going on that evening as well, isn't there? I mean, they're shoring up they're erecting barricades, digging trenches. There's a lot of work going on as well.
I think that this also speaks to this idea that the intention, although they are preparing, and they have prepared for a military confrontation, the intention is to inherit a vacuum to some extent, right? So none of that stuff ideally should have mattered, because they weren't anticipating, what comes, which is 63 days of fighting against the Germans. They were anticipating at best a couple of days, and the Germans would withdraw. So in a sense, we have to not fall into the trap of viewing all of this from hindsight, viewing all of this, from the perspective of the 1st of August, but with all of the hindsight of what comes afterwards, because from that moment, this looks good. They've risen, they've taken large swathes of the west of the city. Not all of their targets have been taken, but they're in control of large swathes of the city, and from the perspective of that first day, this looks good.
The other thing we haven't really talked about yet in this podcast is the civilian reaction. And I've got a really, really fantastic quote from Halina Paszkowska. And what makes this a little bit more poignant, it's actually her granddaughter who is going to be reading her testimony.
I remember when we walked in groups of several people, not all together. The civilian population cheered wildly and welcomed us warmly. Maybe this, maybe that. You are our defenders. You are fighting for us. It was crazily euphoric, which of course changed later.
It's very interesting that at the beginning of the uprising, the civilians were filled with euphoria. It was this amazing moment that Poland finally had the opportunity to fly its own flags and display things that they haven't been able to display. So the Polish eagle, for example, and to go out in the streets and actually be free. This slowly starts to change over time, especially with the civilians and the morale. It begins to bottom out, and resentment starts to be built against the insurgents, because the uprising does go on for 63 days. That's a very long time, with a lack of water, food, hospital equipment, and the conditions just become deplorable at this point. The other really interesting thing is that the High Command end up sending in people to the cellars of all the various different residencies, and they filled out questionnaires on how every person was feeling. So we have this great documentation on how these civilians change their opinions from the beginning of the uprising all the way through towards the end.
Again, and I think you have to see that as well in the context of the previous Polish risings, because you have a sort of similar situation. You have the initial euphoria, and you have the euphoria of 1830 rising, and then the 1863 rising, when again they thought they'd learned the lessons from 1830, and they were better prepared and so on, and it has the same end result. And I think, jumping forward to your point, that once things begin to turn, when the Germans turn against them, and it's absolutely brutal, which we'll come to, the German response to this is unbelievably brutal. And once they then begin to lose the territory as well, and you can see massive losses, particularly civilian losses, and they're losing the territory that they gained in the first couple of days, then those old thoughts creep back. Is this going to be the same? Are we just going to be crushed the same as we were, in the battles against the Soviets and against the Russians with the partitions, and again the crushing of the risings in the 19th century? All of that history, which was known to every Pole at that time, all of that history comes back and says, are we just going to see the same thing again?
Roger, that's actually a really interesting point. These uprisings were so deep-rooted, as you said, and the Poles have been fighting for their freedom for such a long time. So I think you're right. It was going to repeat itself. But moving on, out of curiosity, Claire, what was Zoe wearing at the time of the uprising?
Well, I know that she had a shirt because she pulled her red and white armband over her shirt sleeve. I presume she was wearing a skirt. I mean, what she tended to wear was a skirt and a shirt.
What I find very interesting is that during the uprising, people just turned up in whatever they were wearing. So they could have been wearing a skirt to work or a dress, or the men would be wearing their suit, for example, their hat. And that's what they would end up wearing during the uprising. They literally ran out of their homes to go to war.
But you do get accounts of some, at the end when they're taken out and what they're wearing. Some of the luckier ones have overcoats, but some of them are in nighties and boots, like wellies and nighties, or not wellies, like clod-topper boots that they've managed to get. So yeah, I mean, it's summer dresses.
It's important to mention that the Home Army, the AK, was itself a sort of conglomerate. It had pulled together a lot of these very sort of I'm going to use the only word I've got in my head is vociferous. There were these vociferous units. Almost every sort of political grouping had its own underground during the German occupation, and the Home Army sort of pulled all of that together, finally sort of unifying them. I think in the February of 42 it was quite late, or they unified into the AK. But there are a few outliers of people that sort of stayed beyond that for various reasons. Most notably, the two political extremes of the communist RL, the Armia Ludowa, and the right wing NSZ, the National Armed Forces. So they sort of stayed outside of the big tent of the AK. So consequently, there are sort of some resistance forces within the city that are sort of out of the loop, as it were, when this order goes out. They do come in under the umbrella, and they do fight subsequently alongside AK forces, but initially they are out of the loop. So there are other forces involved in the city at this time as well. So yes, the Ninth Army is the majority of the Wehrmacht forces that are the regular German forces that are operating in the area of Warsaw at that time. It's a unit that had been formed in 1940. They'd fought in the Operation Barbarossa in 41. They'd been mauled in the Kursk salient in 1943. And now, of course, they're on that sort of long, slow, painful retreat westward into Germany itself. And of course, they find themselves having to face this insurgency in Warsaw in the summer of 1944. It's a regular Wehrmacht unit. Is one that we'll be following sort of throughout the rising. We have their Kriegstagebuch, their war diary. So there's lots of entries there that will be illuminating things from the German perspective. So that's the core of German forces is made up from of this Ninth Army. There are, of course, other German units that come into it. Some of them very notorious. That we'll come to in due course, but as I said, the essence of the German forces is this Ninth Army.
So that's the end of the first day of the Warsaw Uprising. Thank you so much for tuning in to our first official episode, and we will see you tomorrow for day 2. Thank you so much for tuning into our podcast on the Warsaw Uprising. If you'd like to give us a one-off donation, you can do on www.ko-fi.com/Warsaw Uprising podcast. We'll be very grateful for that. You can just buy us a coffee or a drink. We could always do with a drink. Before we officially finish, I'd like to thank the following people for taking part in this specific episode. The first person, of course, is our man who does the graphics. That's Steve Smith. Chris Sams for being the research assistant. Zane Whitney for the music and helping me with editing. He's been a godsend. I'd also like to thank the Akt Novich archives for their help and all the information they helped us provide. Dawid Gralik as the voice of Tadeusz Burkomorowski. Klaudia Siczek as the voice of her grandmother, Halina Paszkowska. And of course, my two co-hosts, Roger and Claire. Please make sure to tune in tomorrow for day 2.